the Liberty Podcast with Clint Armitage. We are proclaiming liberty one show at a time, and the next one starts right now. How's it going, everybody? Clint Armitage, the Liberty Podcast. And this episode is called God Did the Impossible. And this is part one of a two-part series. God did the impossible. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a passage, and it's in Matthew 14, verses 13 through 21. It's when Jesus feeds the 5,000. So it's a good look. I mean, this is just one of the examples or one of the miracles in the Bible, in the Gospels that Jesus did that gives you a good look at how God does the impossible. You know, stuff that sometimes we don't even believe ourselves when God does it. We ask for a miracle, God gives us a miracle, and then we question like, was that God or was that just coincidence? So this one is obvious, and this one really helped the disciples understand God. And we'll talk about that a little more in depth here. So again, it's Matthew 14, verses 13 through 21, New International Version. Jesus feeds the 5,000. So let me preface, we're going to read through the verses here, but let me preface it by saying prior to these verses starting, what had happened was John the Baptist, Jesus's cousin, was just beheaded. And he was told by John's disciples that John was beheaded. So now after that information comes to Jesus, now the Bible Matthew gets into the feeding of the 5,000. Okay, so let's start in verse 13. Here we go. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing this, the crowds followed him on foot from the town. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." All right, let's stop there. We'll break it down, and then we'll get more into depth on the actual miracle itself and kind of delve into that. But first thing, so Jesus is kind of a little distraught here, right? He finds out his cousin just got beheaded, so he kind of wants to, be solitary. So he goes to privately go to a solitary place. He gets in a boat, he withdraws, the Bible says, and gets in a boat and goes to a solitary place. But the crowds are following him, and they go track him down. From the towns, they're looking for him, and they go find him. After he withdrew on the boat, he lands, he sees the large crowd, and he has compassion. He doesn't push them away, even though he's a little bit depressed, kind of sad, these things that happened to his cousin here. And instead of pushing them away, he actually turns his focus on them and the Bible says he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Okay. And then as evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "Hey, Lord," basically they're telling him, "Look, this is a remote place. It's getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." So the disciples see like, hey, there's a ton of people here. It's far away from anything. There's no food. There's nothing for them. So they're trying to get Jesus to tell them to go back to the town so they can get something to eat. So verse 16 starts now. So let's get into that. Jesus replied, "They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat." And then they said, "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 baskets of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate are about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Okay, so the feeding of the 5,000 is a lesson about, being truly thankful in what seems to be an impossible situation, okay? Because 5,000 people, and that's not counting women and children. So we're probably looking at, say, 15, 20,000 people there. So it looks like a impossible situation, inwardly, outwardly. So this kind of shows what Jesus is trying to do, or what he does. He displays great faith in God and in the expectation that God is in control and can solve the problem. So what happens is, with his faith, with his expectation that God's going to provide, the result is a huge miracle that even produces leftovers, okay? So think about this. They started with 2 loaves and 5 fish. Then they fed, 15, 20,000 people off 2 loaves and 5 fish. And then God even produced leftovers with that. So that miracle produced even more than necessary. Okay, so why? So that's the first question that comes to my mind is like, why? Why would God produce 12 baskets of leftovers? So I think there's a few reasons here. The first is the number 12 relates to divine governance. okay, and authority. So divine governance and authority. And God's authority reigns over our needs. He governs our provision. So the number 12 is governance, divine governance. So he governs our provision, and God is our provider. And that's why his name is Jehovah Jireh. God is our provider, right? So that's number one. Now, number two, there are 12 disciples. Okay. And then there were also 12 baskets of leftovers. So each disciple basically had a basket of abundance. And God provided more than what was needed through the miracle. And then each disciple was able to personally, intimately experience God's abundance just by collecting that extra basket. So what you can kind of see is that personally, I think that was personal. That was a corporate miracle, right? But then each disciple, 12 disciples, picked up probably a basket each. And it's more on a personal level for them. And so from then on, all 12 disciples could never really forget or deny the fact that God provided more than was needed. He provided more than the needs dictated. And they witnessed an extreme lack, right? And then when instructed by Jesus, he said, "You feed them." All they could do was kind of give to God what was available. And then Jesus, after giving thanks, produced a miracle, making this, the seemingly impossible very possible. And then he finished the miracle by providing abundance so that there were 12 extra baskets of leftovers. Okay, so that was number two. Now, number three is Jesus wanted to show how faith and thankfulness in God during a situation that seems pretty impossible are kind of the key ingredients, right? So for him to provide miracles for us, those are the key ingredients there. So if we look at Jesus' actions before the miracle, we can identify 3 points. Let's look at those 3 points. So the first is a seemingly impossible situation that the disciples are in the midst of. They're part of this seemingly impossible situation. Now, they didn't have control of the situation, right? It came to them. It was something that was just part of a situation that they were a part of. Like they didn't have control over that. The crowds following, and then next thing being hungry and all that stuff. And then they found themselves in the situation. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, the disciples tried to look and solve the situation in their flesh by earthly means, right? Because in verse 25 it says this. It says, "As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, 'This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food.'" Again, they were only looking at the situation, trying to solve the situation on a horizontal plane. But what Jesus was trying to do is he wanted them to look at this seemingly impossible situation on a vertical plane, not a horizontal plane. Because in verse 16 it says this, Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." See, so Jesus is forcing the situation. He's telling them that they need to go find something for these people to eat. And so he's creating a circumstance in their lives, the disciples' lives, that's bringing them to a place where they have to look up for the answer. They can't look horizontally. They have to look to God for the answer because this is, again, seemingly impossible. Jesus could have sent the crowds away, right? But he wanted the disciples to learn and experience the Father's divine governance over necessities in life, our provision. And we know this because it's listed in the book of John. In verse 5 of chapter 6, this is what we read. It says, "When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?' He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Verse 7 says, Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Verse 8 says, another one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" You can see how Jesus intentionally put them in this situation. He put them in a situation where their faith had to overcome all the earthly senses. They had to actually now rely on God and look up, not on a horizontal plane, but on a vertical plane. So sometimes God does that in our lives. He could simply just solve the problem or send the problem away, but he doesn't. Sometimes he just wants us to increase our faith. And then he wants to show us how much bigger he is than our problems. And then he will even solve our problems and provide more than we need, like in this case here with the 12 baskets. And all we have to do is really trust him and trust that he's in control. And we got to have faith that he's going to provide. And no matter how little we have, as long as we give what we have, God can use it. Because if we, had the resources to solve, our own problems, we wouldn't really need God, right? So there's our God Did the Impossible Part 1 episode. Thanks for joining us. This is the Liberty Podcast. I'm Clint Armitage. And until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and keep seeking liberty. For another episode of the Liberty Podcast with Clint Armitage. If you want to get in touch, email us at info@clintarmitage.com.